Okay, we are about ready to begin. My name is Sherman Haywood Cox II. I want to welcome you all to the Preaching in the African American Tradition seminar. Um, Before we begin, I want to read a scripture and open with prayer. I want to read 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 1. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for allowing us to come together to learn truth and to learn how to preach more effectively. We ask that you would strengthen us and bless us as we seek to let others know about the goodness of God through this great African American tradition. We ask all these blessings in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen. So once again, this is Sherman Haywood Cox II of soulpreaching.com. I want to welcome you to Preaching in the African American Tradition. Our agenda is speaker bio. They tell us that you should always talk about who the presenter is. We're going to do that quickly. I want to introduce the subject, and then I want to talk about different dimensions of the African American preaching tradition. That includes African American preaching style. That includes African American preaching themes. That includes biblical hermeneutics in the African American tradition, and it also includes African American sermon structure. Then we will have a conclusion, and we will talk about next steps from here. But that's our basic agenda. We have a lot of stuff to do. Before we begin, I must say a couple of things. First of all, I definitely took African American preaching at seminary, and in that presentation, in that course, we had 15 weeks to talk about the African American preaching tradition. And tonight, all we have is 1 hour. What that means is that we are going to have to talk very quickly over a whole lot of information. What that means is we're only going to be able to touch things very lightly. This is only going to give you a very high level look at African American preaching. But we should see this as the beginning and not as the end of our study. For in the future, we're going to do this particular seminar again, but we also will have seminars on style, themes, hermeneutics, and sermon structure. So what we are looking at here is to give a very high level view of preaching in the African American preaching tradition. Hopefully we will also provide you with some tools and some resources through which you can improve your preaching today. Who am I? I am Sherman Haywood Cox II. I am a preacher's kid, an African American preacher's kid. I have done African American preaching for the last 20 years. I have studied African American preaching in seminary. I have made it a special study at seminary to actually study the African American preaching tradition. I've looked at for example, what happens in the celebration. I've looked at some of C.L. Franklin's sermons at the conclusion and to try to see what exactly is happening in those particular closing moments. I have taken some of those resources and put them up on soulpreaching.com. I have studied other aspects of the African American preaching tradition at seminary. Finally, I teach and celebrate the African American preaching tradition at soulpreaching.com. So I've engaged in it. I've listened to much African American preaching as a child of a preacher, as well as today. A week, not a week goes by without me listening to at least 3 or 4 sermons from different preachers. One of the great things about the advent of the internet is that anyone can grab and listen to many sermons, whether they be through oneplace.com or streamingfaith.com or some of these other resources. And I would encourage you to listen to many sermons. So that I've listened to sermons, I've studied the tradition, and I've engaged in it. And for that particular reason, I have felt called to create soulpreaching.com as well as to present this seminar. Now, another final caveat before we begin is to recognize that this is one person's understanding or one person's view of African American preaching. There are many other views, there are many other resources that we're going to talk about tonight, and I would encourage you to grab a hold of some of these resources to look at other approaches and also to do your own study so that you can come up with your own understanding of what these what this tradition, what this great tradition has to give to us. But that is my bio. That is some background. An introduction to the subject. What is black preaching? When you think about black preaching, what comes to your mind? Is it oftentimes it'll be maybe a preacher that is hooping, maybe it'll be some preacher using flowery or poetic language. Maybe it'll be a preacher who has a very interesting style to his or her preaching. That particular thing, those particular ideas emphasize style as one of the most fundamental understandings or criteria for judging what is black preaching. Interestingly, when we look at the literature, when we look at what many African American preaching theorists are saying, we actually find that style is not something that is emphasized as much as other aspects. There are different dimensions to what is the African American preaching tradition. Some of these dimensions include how we look at the Bible. African Americans use the Bible in a way that can help them to make it through some of the issues and problems that they have to deal with. We are going to talk about that. What are the themes that African American preachers normally preach on, and how do they relate to what others preach on? That is another dimension. How we look at the Bible. What are the themes that we present? And what are the structure of our sermons? When you listen to some African American preachers, listen to someone like Frederick Douglass Haynes, and then you listen to preachers in other traditions, you often can find that there are structural components to the sermons that make it compelling. And so we want to talk about structure as another dimension of the African American preaching tradition. Finally, we definitely cannot forget style that we talked about earlier. Style is an important component of the African American preaching tradition. So when I talk about the African American preaching tradition, I'm talking about 4 dimensions. I'm talking about how we look at the Bible. I'm talking about the themes that are used. I'm talking about the structure of the sermons, and I am talking about style in the African American preaching moment. But the first thing we're going to look at is black preaching style. I definitely, as I hinted at earlier, I definitely believe that style is important. As I noted before, the literature often some of the literature does minimize this stylistic component, but I definitely believe that there is a stylistic component. However, oftentimes the general public or others looking on see the African American preaching tradition as something that is only style, and that's problematic. They see preaching black as making use of these devices or making use of these devices or these stylistic components to prop up whatever their message is. In fact, the mindset is that you've got content and you've got style, and that you can use any style to teach the content. However, in the African American preaching tradition, style and content go together, as we shall soon see. In fact, when done well, style is a part of content. Now, definitely there is a problem when we use style to cover up a lack of content, or we use style to hide the fact that we have not put in the hard work to actually put together a strong sermon. However, when the sermon is done right, then style and content will mesh together into a whole that is hard to break apart or hard to distinguish. Now, I have here a couple of important rules for the use of style in the African American preaching moment. First, style should be natural to the preacher. There is nothing worse. Well, it is one of the biggest problems when a preacher makes use of a style that is not necessarily innate or not natural to that particular preacher. We all have heard preachers who will make a who will do certain devices that they may have heard a television preacher use, or they may have heard others use, and when they do that and it's not coming from them, it actually detracts from the message. Individuals will look and they will wonder, well, what is the preacher saying? Why is the preacher saying something is not right? There becomes a disconnect between the people and the preacher. So whatever style you use, it should be natural to the preacher. Next, and another very important component, is that style, the preaching style, should be consistent with the sermon. We are often told that most of the communication between people is done in a nonverbal way. Whatever your preaching should be consistent, and your style should be consistent with the sermon. So if you're preaching about the goodness of Jesus, something is wrong if you up there frowning. If you are preaching about a sad or a laborious type of idea, something is wrong when you are flippant and jumping around. The style should be consistent with the sermon. Now, this next point is an important one, is that sometimes your natural stylistic component can detract from the message. I remember when I was taking a preaching class where I often was touching my glasses. I was touching my glasses over and over and over again. What happened is that it becomes a distraction. So we must find a way to even rein in our natural characteristics if they detract detract from the sermon. I definitely heard a preacher the other day. I saw a preacher the other day who was walking back and forth, and there definitely is a time to walk. There, some preachers can do it very well, but there is a purpose and a reason. And if the walking detracts and then it starts to look almost like a tennis match where you're going back and forth, if that happens, it can detract from the sermon. So the rules for preaching style that I've come up with here is, first of all, they should be natural to the preacher. Secondly, they should be consistent with the sermon. Both rules are important. Don't set any one aside without having both of them. So the dimensions of style. There are a couple of dimensions of preaching style, especially in the African American preaching tradition, but in other traditions as well. The first of these are mannerisms. Mannerisms. If you were to look at me right now, you would see my hands going and whatever. These are various dimensions of style: mannerisms, gestures, hand movements, pointing and sweeping, facial expressions, and body movement. Whether it is walking and that type of thing. These are various dimensions of physical style, and I think that it is important for African American preachers and preachers in all traditions to make sure that what we do does not detract from the message, and that it is a natural component. I see a question. Someone asked, doesn't this make it tough because your glasses continue to fall? That's actually a good question. In my case, at least, the glasses were not falling. It was a nervous twitch. It was a nervous. Something that was detracting. It wasn't serving a adequate purpose. And so I think that, and this is a good question for, we do not, none of these should be taken as hard and fast rules, but as guidance. Take it, find out what works, and work with it. Allow the Spirit to guide you in your particular presentation. But if your glasses keep falling off, you might want to take them off or do something. But I still would say that the most important component is for you to be an embodiment of the message. That's more important. So that's the most important thing. As we said, there are mannerisms, gestures, hand movements. All of these are aspects of physical aspects of preaching style. I think largely, however, this is something that you would look at some of the videos of your preaching and attempt to rein in those things that are not working, and attempt to find a way to be an embodiment of that particular message. Now let's go to the next. I see a couple of questions going in, and I ask you to forgive me. We will have a question session at the end of each of these sections, and I'll go back to the questions. But let's go on, because there is a physical aspect to style, but there's also an audio aspect to style. And this is probably, when we are speaking of style, we are often speaking of this particular aspect, the audio. And one of the most one of the most important aspects of preaching, especially in the African American preaching tradition, is that there is a musical quality to our particular preaching, and that includes rhythm. Different preachers will use a rhythmic approach. They will change the rhythm of the voice, and you will actually hear this speed up, slow down, eighth notes, 16th notes, whole notes. If you know about music. Uh, the important thing, as we said before, we've got the two rules. It must be natural, and it must support and promote the meaning of the message. For in the African American preaching tradition, and other traditions as well, but especially the African American preaching tradition, we seek to embody the message, and that includes with our gestures and our physical, as well as the audio and what we say. Tone. um, One thing that's important is that often when we are speaking, our voice goes up and down, up and down. The tone of the voice, the tone that we are hit. If we were to transcribe it as a musical notes, we would see some of it goes up and some of it goes down. African American preachers have become masters at recognizing the musical quality of their voice, and emphasizing and pushing that particular aspect of uh, of the voice. Next, there is Black English. There is Black English. Um, Henry Mitchell talks about this. There are definitely some preachers who do not engage in what is meant by Black English. Here we're talking about the language of the masses, which may include the taking on the cliches and the words that are used amongst many of us. It's it's There are definitely some individuals, as I stated, who would disagree with this. I was talking to a preacher the other day who stated that part of the preacher's job is to elevate the people with the English or with the words that are used. And so this preacher actually seeks to use very high language, but many of us seek to use the language of the masses. Uh, but once again, as we said, we must embody the messages. Also, it must be natural, but we do it in such a way that is understood by the people. And so there is some dispute here, but Black English is still an aspect that is used by many, if not most of us. Call and response. Call and response. Many of us interact with the audience, interact with the congregation. We say, and the congregation responds, and we talk back and forth. This is an important component of the tradition. Now, one thing that is important is that this response is not always audio. It's not always shouting. Sometimes it may be just the quietness that comes after somebody's toes have been stepped on. Sometimes it might be other aspects, but it's important to recognize that the call and response, we are leaving room for the people to respond to what is being said in whatever way they will. Role playing is another aspect of the tradition where we oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes take on the character. We become the character that we are preaching about, whether it is a biblical character or whether it is a story that we are telling. And oftentimes we can take on that character and preach from a first person rather than speaking of something that has happened. Will to adorn is another very important aspect of the African American preaching tradition. For The preacher may not just say that the sun came up yesterday. The preacher may say something along the lines of the sun, the great ball of fire burst from the east and kissed the leaves as it made its trek across the sky or something like that. I just came up with that. But at any rate, it provides an example for us to understand that here preachers in the African American preaching tradition will adorn. This is also rhetorical flair. We will say things in many different ways. I was looking at a YouTube video, and I encourage all of you to go to YouTube, look at some of the great preachers, and even some of the not so great preachers that are on YouTube. And there was a discussion about a particular preacher who was taking 10 minutes to say something that could probably have been said in 30 seconds to 1 minute. And some of the people were saying that this was problematic or whatever, but what we are seeing here is a difference between simply stating the facts and uh, and telling a story that seeks to touch people not just in their intellect but in the emotive and the intellect. We are seeking to teach and preach to the whole being and not just the intellect. To do that, we've got to adorn the language. We've got to use rhetorical flair. We've got to tie these concepts up into rhetorical flourishes. And that's something that is definitely done often in the African American preaching tradition. Drama is tied in with this, where oftentimes we don't just tell the story, like we said, not just the facts. We come into the story and we seek to give a dramatic flair to the particular sermon. Repetition is another aspect where we will say the same thing over and over again, either exactly the same way or even in slightly different ways. Why? Because we are seeking to address the whole of the being. And so it may not take 30 seconds. It may take 10 minutes, but we are attempting to preach to that holistic human being. Musicality in preaching. I wanted to go back to this before we move on off of style, because I am not necessarily talking about hooping. There is definitely a musicality in the hooping, but there is rhythm and tone even in certain preachers who may not necessarily be hooping, or even in hoopers when they are not hooping. You will hear the music coming from their voices, and it just flows. And I think that this is an important thing that we should practice. When I used to play the trumpet, I used to practice the trumpet uh, 30 minutes to 40 minutes a day. But there were certain times when I would just practice the playing of certain things. And I think this is an important thing. This wasn't composition. This wasn't those types of things. This was the playing of certain things. And so we need to practice rhythm. How do you say things in different ways? A good book that begins to teach this is The Jazz of Preaching. The Jazz of Preaching is a good book that teaches this. But look at what you had presented, and seek to read your sermon in a different way. Seek to use different rhythms here and there in the practice room. Seek to bring a tone to the preaching that is in line with the message being preached, but still true to yourself. This is in the practice room. When you go to preach, then it's time to just set the practice aside and just preach. But when you're practicing, it's important to add rhythm, it's important to add tone. I would also say, as I am trying to go back to the previous slide, to look at many of these different dimensions. Look at black English. Is there a different way you could have said this to possibly affect different people different ways? Role playing. Look at your sermon. Is there a place where you could have taken on a first person character? Would it have been better if you became David, if you became Daniel, rather than talking about Daniel? Will to adorn, seek to say these things in many different ways. Repetition. The important point is to attempt to allow the message to go deep into the minds of the people and the emotive parts of the people. Now, implementing style. Implementing style, one, remember the two rules. The two rules is one, be true to yourself. You must be yourself. If you are not yourself, the people will know and it will detract from the message. The second rule is that it should support the message. Whatever you do should support the message. Practice these characteristics. I actually don't practice the physical all that much, but I do practice the audio characteristics in the practice room. Strive for a natural but effective style, natural and effective, that supports the sermon. Always be yourself in presentation. And finally, don't overdo it. I'm sure all of us have heard different preachers here and there who have overdone different aspects of style, and it can definitely be problematic and lead us away from the preaching moment. Uh, effective uh, effective hearing of the preaching. Uh, Now, that is our quick overview of preaching style. Are there any questions? Do you have any questions that you would like me to answer at this time before we move on to the next aspect? I will give you a couple of minutes to ask the questions if there are any. Someone asked, do I have a similar preaching? Do you have similar preaching ways like your father? Um, that's that's actually a good question. I'm not sure if the people will necessarily see a ton of similarities, but I definitely do see some similarities between my preaching and my father's preaching. I think part of the issue is you preach like who you listen to the most, and over my life, I probably heard no other preacher more than my father. So I do preach like my father in aspects, and in other aspects, not like him. Are there any other questions? Okay, let's take a 2-minute break, and then we will come back and talk about black preaching themes. Someone asked another quick question before we continue. Um, who do I like listening to? Um, I listen to a number of preachers. A couple of preachers who I am listening to a lot right now is is Jerry Black out of Atlanta. I like his storytelling style. Another preacher is Frederick Douglass Haynes the third out of Dallas, Texas, and he is a master of the 3 points and a poem. These two preachers together provide an interesting dynamic where one really emphasizes the storytelling, and Frederick Haynes, who definitely tells stories. I talk about it on soulpreaching.com, but he really pushes the envelope on the 3 points and a poem sermonic structure. In fact, oftentimes, especially in some homiletic circles, 3 points in a poem is looked down upon. But Frederick Haynes, because he's such an effective preacher, making use of the 3 points in a poem, it is difficult to set that aside. And so I've talked about 3 points in a poem many times. In fact, I am going to talk about it some tonight when we get to the sermon structures. But now, since I don't see any other questions, we will move on to black preaching themes. Black preaching themes. One thing that I must emphasize, and I didn't talk about it earlier, but I need to talk about it, is that most of what we are presenting this evening, uh, most of it has, most of it is found in other preaching traditions. It's not only in the African American preaching tradition. Each and every one of those themes that we talked about, each and every one of those characteristics of style that we talked about can be found in other preaching traditions. I was actually surprised by looking at black preaching by Henry Mitchell to find that even hooping is found amongst white churches, especially in the South, in the rural South. I was looking at some local cable channel, and a backwoods Baptist preacher came up and really started hooping. It doesn't sound exactly the same, but it is the same idea where musicality is integrated into the sermon. And Henry Mitchell noted that this is called the holy wine. And so these themes, the structures, the biblical hermeneutic, as well as the style, none of these things are totally unique to African American preaching. However, African American preaching pulls it all together in a very valuable and helpful way. So I definitely wanted to say that before we begin when we're talking about black preaching themes, because these themes are found in other in other ethnic traditions who seek to preach. First thing I wanted to talk about are categories of the themes that we find in black preaching. You see up on the page Cleophas LaRue's book, The Heart of Black Preaching. I would encourage all of you to, if you can, to go and grab this particular book. This section, the categories of black preaching, is found largely from that a section in that book. In fact, these categories of preaching are very helpful for preachers to make sure that they are preaching the whole counsel and not just preaching a hobby horse or a small aspect of the tradition. There are many different aspects that we must preach if we are going to be true to what God would have us to preach. The first of these is personal piety. I think that it is important to talk about personal piety. Now, we have a very eclectic group here. There are holiness people who have registered for this particular seminar, as well as we found certain Pentecostals who have signed up for this. Some Methodists have signed up for this. Seventh-day Adventists have signed up for this, as well as Baptists, who is by far the most more. We had more registrations that were Baptist than any other. But I say that to say this, that different denominational traditions will put in different emphasis on different aspects of this particular these particular categories. However, if we are to be true to the full counsel, we must preach all of them, which includes personal piety, includes heart religion. If we are going to preach effectively in the African American preaching tradition, as well as being true to preaching the whole counsel of God, then we must say something about heart religion. We must say something about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. There are some individuals who would think that we need to not spend so much time here, but we must talk about the ability of God to change individuals. In fact, there are some individuals who believe that social justice is where our emphasis should be, and we will talk about that. But I wish to say that if God has the power to overcome racism in this country, then God has the power to get me to overcome the sin that doth so easily beset me. I would say that they are tied together. We must teach both. And so we must have this personal piety aspect if we are going to preach. So we should, over the life of our sermons, we should have some sermons in the personal piety category. Another category is care of the soul. This is the pastoral component. If we are going to be true, we should not only talk about living right, but we also should talk about God's ability to help us through whatever problems we find ourselves in. So God has a healing component. God has a guiding component. God has a sustaining, and God has a reconciling. If we are going to be true to the African American preaching and to preach the whole counsel, then we must preach about care of the soul. Now, to be honest with you, LaRue, if I remember correctly, believes that this is where most of us being African American preachers, spend most of our time. We spend most of our time talking about personal piety, about overcoming, about living right, about setting aside the sins that so easily beset us. Somebody asked, what is heart religion? That's what I'm talking about. Setting aside the sins setting aside sins, living a pure life, and having the personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Some denominational traditions would spend much emphasis there, but this is where we spend a lot of time. Care of the soul also is where others would spend a lot of time. But so these are where we spend really a lot of our time. I think the important thing is for preachers to look at your sermons, look at them over a long period of time, and make sure that you're hitting each of these things as often as you would like to hit these things. Personal piety is one, care of the soul, but we've got to continue looking at these categories. Another is social justice. We are preaching about God's ability to change structures, to attack structural problems. This is where we get social justice, and many African Americans are experts at talking about social justice. I think that it's important, however, to recognize that this social justice is not just racism. Some of us are very good at talking about race, but not so good at talking about the sexism that is rampant in much of our churches. Some of us are really good at talking about racism, but we ain't got nothing to say about ageism or other aspects. And another thing is, some of us are very good about talking about problems to others. I remember one of my professors told us that the church will lose its credibility if the church does not apply the same prophetic word to itself that it applies to others. So if we want to talk about America ain't being right, then we've got to recognize our not being right. And so our preaching must encompass not just they wrong, but also when we are wrong. So social justice is an important component. Another component is corporate concerns. Here we're talking about, and what Cleophas LaRue was speaking of is racial, the corporate group being the racial group. Here we're talking about self-help, pulling yourself by your bootstraps, uplift, going to school, getting a job, working hard. Here you are speaking of what the gospel means for us as a group. So we've got social justice, we've got corporate concerns, and finally maintenance of institutions. We must recognize that there is that we do find ourselves in denominations, we find ourselves in buildings, we got to pay for the building, we got to preach about tithe, we got to preach about paying for the buildings. We've got to maintain these institutions. Now, we may argue about we've got too much money in institutions or whatever, but at any rate, unless you non-denominational, or and some of you are, but unless you are in your own group, and even when you are in your own group, you still have some sort of institutions that you've got schools, if you got something that you are seeking to build up. At any rate, you will have times where you need to preach about that. In addition, there will be times where you need to preach about theological, the theology that's found in your particular church. If you're Baptist, there will be times when it is time to talk about baptism. There will be times definitely when it is time for you to talk about things that are important to your particular institution. So as I said before, it's important to when you are looking at themes, here we are just making sure that we are hitting the whole counsel, which includes maintenance of institution, which includes corporate concerns, which includes social justice. It also includes, as we talked about before, personal piety and care of the soul. As preachers, we should have in mind how we think we should spend our time in these different aspects, and we should also emphasize and preach in each of these things. Now our time is moving very quickly, so I want to go on and talk quickly about the theology of grandma. The theology of grandma. If we are going to preach effective sermons in the African American preaching tradition, we must include the practical theology that's helped us through much of what we've gone through. And a very important book for that is Soul Theology by Nicholas Cooper Luter and Henry Mitchell. And this particular book provides different themes to preach in the African American preaching tradition. One of these is holistic liberation, as I talked about before. If God has the ability to overcome racism in this country, then God has the ability to help me to overcome the sins that are in my life. If God has the ability to help me to overcome the sins in my life, then God has the ability to help overcome the structural problems, which includes racism and sexism and the other issues that we have to deal with in this country. The providence of God, I've got to go quickly, forgive me, but the providence of God, God is the one sitting on the throne and is guiding things, and God will only allow will not allow anything to come to you that you cannot bear. The grace of God. God is a graceful God. God will forgive us of the sins that we have committed. Perseverance of persons. There were a couple of Calvinists who've signed up for this particular webinar. There may be more, but perseverance of persons is not necessarily perseverance of the saints. This is the idea you can make it. You are in the midst of issues, you're in the midst of problems, you can make it. You will not be overcome, because God is going to make sure that you are not overcome by the problems that are in this life. So it's the perseverance of persons. Humanity is a family. All of us are brothers and sisters under God, who is our heavenly parent, who's the Father on the throne. Humanity is a family. God brings good out of evil. God does not allow evil to have the last word. In fact, God will squeeze good even out of evil. Finally, God is just. While God is graceful, while God does have grace, God is also has justice. And God is a just God. These are some of the themes that we preach in the African American preaching tradition. I'm sorry that I had to go through that so quickly, but I would encourage you to purchase the book Soul Theology. Look at some of these themes, and I would bet if you are preaching in the African American preaching tradition, you are already using many of these themes. You are preaching with these themes, especially if you are an effective preacher. But as we said, themes, when we're looking at the themes, look at these themes on the Theology of Grandma. Also, look at your sermon in light of these different, look at your number of sermons, many sermons, in light of these different characteristics, categories, whether they be personal piety, care of the soul, do a social justice, corporate concerns, and maintenance of institution. Do a audit of your sermons and see where you are spending most of your time. Do we have any questions at this point? I want to talk about hermeneutics. We are going to have to go very quickly. Let's see here. Oh, I see a number of questions. I see a number of questions. Someone asked, this is a while back. I asked you to forgive me for I have sinned. I am not. This is our first webinar, so I just saw. I didn't think that I had many questions, and now I see a number of these questions. What about eye contact when you are trying to read from notes? There are a couple of issues that one must deal with when reading from notes. The biggest problem with lack of eye contact is not knowing your manuscript well enough. Uh, you really need to read your manuscript over and over again until you know it. Um, or if you don't write a manuscript, write an outline and memorize the outline and preach from it. I think that eye contact is very important, and so you really should not be in your manuscript to the point where people cannot see you. I would encourage you to go. I just published a video called Preaching Without Notes that came out not too long ago. It's on soulpreaching.com. It's about 15 minutes, I believe, and it'll talk about different aspects for doing that. Who is the author of Jazz of Preaching? That's Kurt Byron Jones. Go to Amazon.com and purchase the book. It is a very good book. In fact, it is a semester course in a book. There's questions and exercises at the end of each chapter. I would definitely encourage you to go and purchase that book. Someone asked, do you feel the use of PowerPoint in preaching detracts from the traditional African American style? Yes and no. In the right hands, PowerPoint can be very effective. In the wrong hands, it can be definitely problematic. Hopefully I'm doing a good job with PowerPoint right here, but I'm not actually preaching a sermon. But I would say that if you as a preacher feel that PowerPoint is distracting from your message, then set it aside. It's not all that important. What's important is the message. Let's see, within style, how can we try to maintain ourselves without becoming a character? Within style, how do we try to maintain ourselves? I think the question is, how do we stay true to ourselves? The biggest, you are going to have to be the biggest criteria for that. So what you do is you look at your sermons, you look at yourself. You must become a student of yourself. Look at yourself. If you look like you're not being true to yourself, then set it aside. Don't do whatever that is. If it's detracting from the message, set it aside. If you're jiggling your glasses, set it aside. Whatever it is, you are the one who's determining the criteria. I'm not the criteria, neither is somebody else. You are the criteria for determining that. Let me see here. Hello, Pastor Cox. Considering the fact that some denominations are more conservative than others, do you have any tips when preaching to folks of other perspectives on proper preaching etiquette? This is a good question. I would say that you want to be true to both yourself as well as where you are preaching. I was one of my professors showed a couple of his sermons. One sermon was preached in an African American church. Another sermon was preached in a it was an urban African American church. Another sermon was preaching in an affluent church that was predominantly white. In both instances, the preacher was true to himself, yet it was not exactly the same. So I think that it's important to recognize where you are preaching and to preach to people in that particular venue while being true to yourself. Okay, here's a good question. I understand the audio characteristics, but how do you practice the physical characteristics? I would definitely say that personally, I probably don't practice them as much as I necessarily could or should, but I think the best way to do that would be in front of a mirror. But a better way is to look at yourself while you're preaching. By that I mean take videos of yourself and seek to look at yourself and how you do different things. And you can look in the mirror, but I think that it's important to look at yourself and study yourself on the video. Uh, how long before you determine your style? It's probably a lifetime thing. You're going to be learning, and as you change, your style is going to change. In fact, one individual told me that oftentimes we do change. Preachers oftentimes yell a lot when they are younger, but as they get older, they instead of yelling, they do other things, and they find out that you don't necessarily have to yell to get your point across. Again, who is the author of Jazz of Preaching? Sorry, that's Kurt Byron Jones. I'm sorry that I'm only getting to these questions now. Uh, uh, Someone asked, can you finish the seminar first since you're running out of time, and then answer questions? That's a good idea. Uh, I would, I would definitely. We've only got one more question. When preaching without notes, in order to familiarize, what should a preacher have? When preaching without notes, in order to familiarize yourself, when should a preacher have his sermon finished? That's a good question. I would say that the preacher should be finished as soon as possible. But there are definitely different ways. I would encourage you to go to preaching to look at the video at soulpreaching.com. I have I've totally run out of time. I've got 2 minutes left, and we have got a number of slides to go through. I would ask you to forgive me, as I am going to take 10 minutes and go through these slides very quickly. African American biblical hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is simply a highfalutin way of saying biblical interpretation. Some individuals believe that there's only one way to do biblical interpretation, but really biblical interpretation changes based on what questions you bring to the text. And so a poor man is going to bring different questions to the text, and are going to see different things in the text than a rich man. Someone who has been in the midst of problems, who's about to lose their house, is going to see different things in the text than someone else. The African Americans have traditionally come to the Bible, and once again, I am strongly influenced by Henry Mitchell's very helpful book, Black Preaching, The Recovery of Lost Art. But we have basically looked at the Bible as God on humanity's side. We look in the Bible for God on humanity's side. When we read the Bible, we're looking for God with the weak. When we read the Bible, we are looking for God making a practical difference in life. We are not looking for theoretical issues. We are not looking for theoretical and theological hair splitting. We are looking for practical ideas. We are looking for gospel and not science. We are looking for an imaginative. We do an imaginative reading of the Bible. Finally, we look at the Bible as my story. We read ourselves into the Bible. Now, I did that very quickly. I want to do a quick example of what I mean, which is Jonah. Let's look at Jonah again. Some preachers may come up and argue and say whether the fish existed or not. Did the fish exist? They would argue you must believe that the fish existed, and then sit down as if the sermon is done. However, black preachers would come along, and instead of asking, did the fish exist, they ask, is there anything in this story? Is there anything in this story that's going to help me understand that God is on humanity's side? Is there anything in this story where we see God with the weak? Is there anything in this story with God making a practical difference? Gospel is what we are teaching, not science. I would first of all, lest I would be misunderstood, I believe that the fish did swallow up Jonah. But when you preach that, you are preaching God on humanity's side. And there is much in the text to help you to preach that. God forgiving humanity, God being on the side of humanity because Nineveh was sinners and they actually got the grace of God. Jonah himself sinned by running away from God, and yet God still was on humanity's side. So the point that I'm making here is that we are looking for practical difference in the lives of our people, rather than arguing over whether the fish existed or not. Finally, we must talk about African American preaching structure. I want to quickly talk about celebration. Celebration is an important component of African American preaching tradition. If you just take one thing away from this seminar, it is that you should end your sermon mostly. Now, it's not a hard rule, but most of the time you should end in celebration. What is celebration? Where you hold up the gospel truth for celebration, where people feel the truth of the gospel and they just celebrate it through their emotions, their intellect and their emotions celebrate that particular truth. I think one other point that I must add, that I must emphasize, is that it must be connected to the sermon's point. I've talked about this on soulpreaching.com. If your celebration is not connected to the sermon's point, what you will do is obliterate the sermon from the people's minds. So you must connect the sermon to the point. I mean, you must connect your celebration to the point. So don't just preach anything and then come in with the cross at the end that ain't got nothing to do with your sermon. All they gonna remember is what you said at the end. If you gonna preach about the cross, then you best connect the cross to your sermon and then celebrate. But don't just come in and throw these things up there. I talked about this quickly. Celebration could obliterate the point. Celebration is very powerful because it engages all of our senses. But celebration is the icing on the cake. It's the gravy on the meat and not the meat itself. Let's continue on. Implementing Celebration. A very good book here is Celebration and Experience by Henry Mitchell, as well as They Like to Never Quit Praising God by Frank Thomas. A very good book. I would encourage you to get that particular book, They Like to Never Quit Praising God, for he gives you a tool for beginning your sermon with the celebration in mind. But I will give you a couple of things to keep in mind. Think of stories that will hit the sermon home. Most sermons should end in celebration, as I said before. And the celebration is what the people remember. So connect that point to your particular sermon. Connect the celebration to your sermon. If they remember the celebration, they will remember your sermon. Another powerful aspect of sermon structure is narrative or stories. It may be one narrative or it may be a number of narratives or stories. Many preachers, especially African American preaching tradition, are judged by how well they tell the story. I was talking to a preacher the other day, a lay person who had listened to a sermon, remembered every point that the preacher gave. Why? Because each point that the sermon gave was illustrated. Each point that the preacher gave was illustrated with stories. And these stories were powerful stories. And so because the people remembered the stories, the people remembered the points of the sermon. And so narrative is an important component. Celebration is an important component. As I said, you may have a sermon that's all narrative, or you may have a number of narratives. Finally, the progress of a sermon. This is the hum by Evans Crawford, where we look at the progress of a sermon, a sermon in African American preaching tradition, from how it affects the listener. It begins where the listener comes with "Help 'em, Lord." They're beginning to get on track, they're beginning to get online. That's all right. Is when it's the truth of the message is beginning to come in, and then amen is when they hit it. They believe the message, they know the message, and they are ready to live the message. Glory, hallelujah, is when you hit them with the celebration at the very end. So this is the progress of the sermon when looking at it from the aspect of the people who are hearing the particular sermon. Finally, other structures. We can't spend a lot of time here, but luckily you can go to soulpreaching.com and find information on Hagel's dialectic, as well as 3 points and a poem, which is a very helpful component for understanding structure, for structuring African American preaching. But when we are talking about African American structure, two things to keep in mind: narrative, stories. You want to find stories to illustrate your points, and you want to end in celebration. How it works: the preacher has in mind, how does putting together a sermon work in the African American preaching tradition? Preacher has in mind these themes and these different categories. The preacher looks at the Bible with the lens of the preacher's hermeneutic that we had talked about. What side is God's on? God on the side of the people. The preacher takes the output of this work and structures it into a sermon, keeping in mind celebration, keeping in mind narrative, keeping in mind that you may use Hagel's dialectic or 3 points and a poem. And then finally, the preacher preaches the sermon using the style that the preacher has worked through. Once again, I ask you to forgive me for going so long. I had to take these extra 10 minutes. I will stay on a little longer to answer any other questions that you have. I will continue to answer these questions. But I definitely wanted to let you know that all of our ebooks are on sale. We have a super sale, soulpreaching.com/super sale. All ebooks are on sale. They're available for $30 until noon tomorrow. After then, we will up it to $50 for everything. And then next week, we'll go back to regular price. This is in line with our webinar. This is the back of the room sale, $30 for everything if you want. I want to thank you for attending this seminar. Please attend our next seminar. We will be much better about time. I would encourage you to let me know, send emails, let me know what seminars you want to be done. We will definitely do this one again, being much more timely. We also will do a workshop kind of seminar where we talk about 7 steps to an effective sermon. So I thank you. I thank you for attending. And if you have any other questions, go ahead and send them on now, and we will seek to answer these questions. God bless you, and until next time, this is Sherman Haywood Cox II of soulpreaching.com. You have been to our first webinar. God bless you.